A night of tranquility at the great house, and those who live within sleep peacefully in their beds, unaware of the trials and tribulations to come. For soon they will encounter an ancient force called up from the depths of hell itself, a force intent on unleashing terror at Collinwood. Be careful, my friend, where you tread, for I warn you now, there are spoilers ahead. Welcome. Just a few news bites before we dive into today's show. I'm really excited to see that Dark Shadows and Beyond, the Jonathan Frid story, has won several awards, including the Indie Film Award for Best Documentary Feature. So congratulations to Mary O'Leary there. Make sure you check out the documentary if you haven't seen it yet. It is fantastic. Oh, and by the way, I want to thank Ricardo Delgado for sending me his beautiful book, Dracula of Transylvania. Oh my goodness, this is incredible. It's written and illustrated by Ricardo Delgado with a foreword by Donald F. Glute. So two noted Dark Shadows fans, I might add. So Ricardo wrote and illustrated Dracula of Transylvania, which is a modern retelling of an ancient classic. Dracula of Transylvania is a fresh, bold retelling of the classic Stoker dark fairy tale with the pace of the modern thriller, a gripping new novel lavished with incredible art from one of Hollywood's leading conceptual designers. Ricardo, I want to thank you for sending this book to me. It is just absolutely gorgeous. Folks, check it out. You can find it on Amazon by Clover Press. I am just really blown away by how beautiful this book is. It's really great. So thank you so much, Ricardo, for sending this my way. I am honored and delighted to have this. Also, Ansel Farage's The Dr. Mabuse trilogy is now available. It's on Amazon. I am looking at it right now. And as I am speaking, I am adding it to my cart, proceeding to checkout, and I am placing my order. I am looking forward to getting that. And last but not least, if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe, be sure to rate, be sure to review, and be sure to share with your friends. You spread the word, spread it like the dream curse, through sight and sound and faceless terror at Collinwood. I am your horror hostess, Penny Dreadful, aka Danielle, and I am joined by my good friend, Ricardo Rebelo. Rick is a filmmaker, professor of communications, actor, and podcaster. He's the co-host of the Geek Dad podcast, former director of the Rhode Island International Horror Film Festival, and creator of the documentary Elizabeth, A Victorian Nightmare, about Lizzie Borden, our local homegirl here. And that, I think that airs on Rhode Island PBS every year around Halloween. Yeah. He's a longtime friend and big fan of horror and Dark Shadows. And I'm so excited that we can finally do this, because we've talked for many years about all of this stuff. So it's kind of fun to do it in podcast form today. So welcome, Rick.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited. I've listened to all of the episodes of Terror at Collinwood, and I'm humbled to be a part of it, because you've had some absolutely phenomenal, amazing guests on this show, and I'm so glad to be a part of it.
Thanks, Rick. Well, it's an honor having you here, and I'm really excited that we're going to get to talk about all of this stuff. We usually do like on a regular basis anyway, so I feel like it's just going to be us like hanging out and geeking out about this stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. We love talking about spooky things.
Indeed. So tell us, tell our audience here about what got you into horror and what got you into Dark Shadows as well.
Both things sort of dovetail together. I was born in the early 1970s, a little bit after Dark Shadows live run. And Dark Shadows was one of those things that was always part of the horror ether. You know, it was always there in magazines and print and at like you in reruns. You know, the rerun series that you watched or the rerun series that I watched was the stuff coming from Cape Cod, the stuff on PBS, Channel 56, Channel 38. We both grew up watching Dialing for Dollars in Massachusetts, and Dialing for Dollars would play Hammer films every day at 3:00. So, you know, Hammer played a huge role initially in my love of horror. Certainly in the mid to late 70s, the slasher genre, mostly John Carpenter's films. And also growing up with, you know, Stephen King, you know, growing up reading those books because once again, our ages coincide with those things all coming out initially. And I've always been attracted to horror and spooky things and dark things. And certainly growing up in Fall River with, you know, one of the most notorious alleged hatchet murderers in history. The first house my parents bought when we moved to the U.S. was on 3rd Street, which was one street over from Lizzie Borden Street. So even as a child, like Lizzie Borden was one street over. The house was one street over. So horror was always in the air. Did you watch the Elizabeth Montgomery Lizzie Borden movie when you were a kid? Yeah. It was so cool, you know, watching that and knowing that that's right next that. I mean, cool, but creepy too, you know, that's right next door. She was a good Lizzie Borden too. She really was, you know. Yeah. And the other thing, you know, in the 70s had like this embarrassment of riches when it came to made for TV horror films. Yeah. And that was just one of the many, you know, when you think of like, obviously Salem's Lot, which is to this day, arguably the greatest made for TV horror miniseries ever, I think. Sure. Oh, it was so good. Oh, and then Kolchak, you know, the Night Stalker. Yeah, Kolchak. Yeah, sure. Happy anniversary to Kolchak, the Night Stalker. They're going into their 50th anniversary. That's right. Yeah. And there's a Kickstarter for a graphic novel that's coming out in Moonstone. I believe it's James Aquilone is running that one. And I've already given them my money. And I already had given them my money for their previous Kickstarters. I feel like we're kind of close to the same age. And we're the 70s monster kids. We're the kids that experienced the 70s monster craze. We missed the 60s monster craze just by that much. But we got like the remnants of it. And then that fed into the 70s monster craze. I call that like the aftershock because 60s was the shock theater package, right? So we got kind of like the aftershock of that in the 70s. And there was a ton of like monster stuff in the 70s too. I think our generation is the last kind of generation that experienced reruns as the primary mode of television in the afternoon. Like when you'd get home from school, you know, they were airing these affiliates were airing reruns of, you know, stuff like Bewitched and Gilligan's Island and The Brady Bunch and F Troop and all of this stuff was like the Monkees. I love the Monkees. I grew up watching that stuff and even when I was a little kid, like I was like, I didn't really make much of a distinction between this is an older TV show and this is a new TV. This is what's on TV. Exactly. Like, that was what was on. Black and white, Lost in Space. Sure. I'll watch that. Right. That's awesome. You know, there's a robot and Dr. Smith. Of course I'm going to watch that, you know. You know, for us, Dark Shadows was just a very organic extension of that because it was and then for us being horror kids, you know, when you start seeing vampires and werewolves and all of these things right away, that goes right to that part of our brain where we're like, oh, this is where I need to be. Yeah. And at that period of time. Definitely. And you, I mean, being a horror fan and like myself too, you know, we were already seeing, you know, we caught like the tail end of Famous Monsters of Filmland, the Aurora kits and stuff like that. So my uncle was a 60s monster kid, you know, so he passed that stuff to me, like those Famous Monsters. And I remember the one with the Basil Gogos Barnabas cover. He gave me that one and the bubble gum cards and stuff. So all the pop cultural ephemera that surrounded Dark Shadows added to the mystique of it even before I got to see it. See, my Uncle Valdemar's were David Mello and Dan at the library. Yeah, David Mello. Because Dave Mello gave me his collection of Aurora monsters. Yeah. And I'm thinking 1986. And Dan would sell me the used copies of Fangoria and Gore Zone and everything else that was left over at the library before they threw it out, before they binned it. So I would buy stacks and stacks of Fangoria and Famous Monsters and Starlog and all of those things, and there's nothing better than being a Catholic school kid and the nun walks by and you have a copy of Fangoria up at your desk, and she's just absolutely mortified. God bless Sister Mary Lourdes, wherever she is, But that was also the fun of being that kind of kid,
Mm-hmm. And also, we're both Portuguese. We both our parents are from. You were born in Portugal, right? In the Azores,
yes, I was.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you came here when you were like a little kid, right? And my parents came. I was first generation here, but my parents came here. Do you think there's any kind of like anything that resonates with regard to like Dark Shadows or just horror in general?
I think with us, it's because we're only one generation separated from folklore.
Yeah.
Like,
that's true.
Our background in, with being around people, like I remember, my grandmother very much believed that there was such thing as curses and
mine
witches
too.
and things like that, so we're not far from that, whereas the average person in the United States, that kind of goes back to like the 1800s or 70s. But for us, it's like our grandparents believed in this, supernatural stuff very much.
Big time. Yeah. And it comes up. And I remember being, they'd always say, as ilhas são encantadas, the islands, the Azores are enchanted,
right.
And there's this whole belief, that it might have been part of Atlantis, and then all out of the ghost stories and bruxas for sure, witch stuff. Witchcraft is like a big, even especially in the continent too, the continental
very
Portugal.
Much.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think that's what kind of ties us into characters like Angelique.
Yeah,
because like we grew up with people talking about people like Angelique, like they knew this woman was like her, like a bruxa. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh,
I remember, my grandmother would like bury things. Like she'd get certain saints and bury them outside in the yard, or they'd have to go someplace and bury them somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Or she thought that someone put a curse on our foot. So for us, we watch Dark Shadows. It's like we're not that distant from people thinking in those terms. You know what I mean?
Totally. My grandmother would watch it with me, was because I'd watch it usually with my Uncle Val, but also my cousin Karen, and we'd be watching. My grandmother would be sitting there watching it with us because she watched it in the 60s too, even though she didn't speak English, but she kind of got the gist. But she couldn't even look at the screen when Barnabas would show his fangs. She'd go, she'd hide her eyes. And then Angelique too, the same thing. It's like just really, she'd get very upset. She could not look at the screen when Barnabas would show his fangs.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean that goes. I'm sad that I was introduced to Coffin Joe later on in my life, because when you want, if you're a Dark Shadows fan, if you get a chance, you definitely got to look for the Coffin Joe films by Jose Mujica Martins.
Yeah.
And what I love about Coffin Joe is that whole idea of like he's evil because he's eating meat on Friday.
Oh, I love that so much. I love that so much. That is so Portuguese. I know it's Brazilian, but it's close enough.
He's eating that leg of lamb, and there's a procession outside his window.
It's so evil.
Gives him a benediction.
Yes, and he's like relishing it. He's enjoying it so much, eating that meat on Friday. And for those you definitely, I've mentioned before, my friend Raymond Castile, who does Raymond Castile's Basement of Horror, he had the opportunity to play Coffin Joe, the young Coffin Joe, an embodiment of evil. And he's done some really fun fan films as well, The Blind Date of Coffin Joe and stuff that's all on YouTube.
Ray's like the doppelganger of Coffin Joe.
My God.
Crazy.
It's amazing. If you ever see him in person dressed as Coffin Joe, I have a great picture of him pretending to battle Guru, where he's holding the chair. It's just uncanny. It's just uncanny. Anyway, so
we like horror.
We do. Yes, we do indeed. So one of the things we were going to do today is we've talked before off mic about the different remakes and reboots of Dark Shadows. And Rick came up with the idea of ranking these different versions because there've been various attempts. And so we're going to be looking at, usually these retellings are with the Barnabas storyline. Barnabas being released from the coffin is usually the basis for each of these. And there are 4 that we're going to look at, and we're going going to rank them. And they are House of Dark Shadows, the 1991 revival series from NBC, the 2004 unaired WB pilot, and the 2012 Tim Burton film. Now, I think this isn't going to be very difficult to do, but there are some surprising things that upon contemplation, I was like, there's some of these. There were a couple that were actually kind of tough, believe it or not, to rank. So we're just going to start at number 4 and I guess work our way up to number 1. Does that sound good to you, Rick?
Sounds good to me.
Awesome. All right. What's your number 4? What's your least favorite of the 4?
I'll be honest with you, it's actually tough for me. I have, to me, it's close between the Tim Burton movie and 2004.
Me too. I had the same. That's what I meant when I was like, this is actually more difficult than I thought.
It's close. Yeah. It really is.
They both have their pros and cons.
Yeah. Well, I will say to my death that the Tim Burton movie has the right cast, but the wrong tone.
Yes.
I think that if a filmmaker wanted to do a very serious modern version of Dark Shadows, they would be hard pressed to get a better cast than the one Tim Burton had, which shows that sometimes it's the execution, not just the setup, because I really think, I feel that Michelle Pfeiffer, of all the Elizabeth Collins Stoddards, outside of the great untouchable Elizabeth Collins Stoddard, that she has this gravitas and she can really pull off being the dominant matriarch. I think that she has that ability and she has it in the film. I think that Helena Bonham Carter is about as weird and quirky as you need to be, to play the Doctor. I think if Johnny Depp had taken it seriously and not put on so much pancake makeup, he could have played Barnabas with a lot more depth. A lot, and even Johnny Lee Miller. I talked to you about Johnny Lee Miller and the Benedict Cumberbatch Frankenstein on stage in England being one of my favorite horror things of the modern time, and I stick to that as well. So not bad. I mean, not a bad cast, it's just bad execution.
Yeah.
Whereas 2004, it stinks of being a low budget UHF cable show. They got lucky that they somehow casted Jessica Chastain, but even then they have her playing
she was Carolyn.
Carolyn, yeah. And it doesn't look like her at all either. It's kind of strange. But I feel like that cast with Blair Brown, it was definitely the weakest of all of them. And you and I have talked about how Alec Newman is good, but he looked kind of weird.
Yeah. He's a good actor. Right? He's a good actor, but I felt for Barnabas, it was an odd choice for Barnabas. He's excellent in those Big Finish audios. He's David Collins, the grown-up David Collins. He's actually really good in that. And I've seen him in other things where he's really good, but I just felt it was an odd, and they made him look strange too. Yeah.
Yeah. He was wearing some sort of wig or something that wasn't. His head didn't look right. It just looked weird.
He needed the bangs. He needed the pointy bangs.
Yeah. I mean, not for nothing, but there's something to that,
There is. That's something, the Johnny Depp version, the Burton version, I think that's part of what Barnabas looks like,
Yeah, that's part of the eccentricity. It's like you got to have the ring, the cane, and the weird bangs.
Yep. And the cloak, the coat. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And so I just felt on that one, the tonality wasn't. I can understand why when the network looked at it, they were like, because there wasn't anything about it that made you feel as if it was going to be a really breakout hit. Now, I think they picked Newman because he had just came off of Dune on the Sci-Fi Channel, and Dune had been pretty successful. So they're probably trying to capitalize off that, but obviously that didn't work. So, all right, what are your opinions on those, though?
Okay, so which one is your 4 then? Is it Burton Depp or is it 2004 pilot?
I'd have to say if you said to me I had to sit down and watch one right now, I would rather watch probably the Tim Burton one than the 2004. Just because even though I hate it, I wouldn't be bored.
Yeah. So the 2004 is your least favorite. Okay.
Probably, yeah.
I have very similar thoughts to yours. I echo everything you said, because the Tim Burton movie, my big problem with the Tim Burton movie is like yours, is the tone. And for such a big film that had a lot of anticipation going into it, not only from Dark Shadows fans, but just from horror fans, pop culture fans, Tim Burton fans. And of course, we know Tim Burton's very quirky and stuff, but he kept saying he was a fan of the original show. Johnny Depp kept saying he was a fan. And we had Sleepy Hollow, which had a lot of Hammer kind of vibe going on in it. And I think a lot of people were hoping for something that was closer to Sleepy Hollow. And what we ended up with was a fish out of water comedy with a lot of really bad sex jokes in it. But
the funny thing now is like when I look back and I realize it's like, look back and really look at Tim Burton's resume. It's like Pee-wee's Big Adventure.
Yeah.
Well, you'll go all the way back to Vincent and Frank and Weenie.
Weenie, yeah.
Right? Frank and Weenie, Vincent, Pee-wee's Big Adventure, Beetlejuice. Then you get Batman, Edward Scissorhands. It's like
there's a lot of
Ed
comedy.
Wood. Yeah, they were all comedies.
It's true. Yeah, Mars
So
Attacks.
in a way, it's like when you look back, you're like, oh, we should have seen it coming.
Yeah, it's true. You're right. And I always say I wish Guillermo del Toro had been the one to do it because he would have gotten it. I think Guillermo del Toro would have nailed it, honestly. He is a massive fan of Gothic horror. He grew up reading all those novels and watching those films. I think he would have poured that into it. So, but that said, the cast, like you said, for the Burton film was a really great cast. Yep. The visuals were excellent. And I had Stuart Manning on here recently, and he was talking about how he can see how that was Tim Burton felt that was an homage to the show, because Tim Burton looks at things from a very visual perspective. He doesn't really care about story as much as he does about visuals. If you look at the visuals in that film, that house looks like Collinwood. It looks like he made it look like Seaview Terrace. They built something that looks like that. And the interiors were very, very ornate and a bit over the top, but kind of cool to look at. Must have spent a fortune on that. Depp looked amazing. The outside of the clownish over the top makeup, like he actually, and the nails, the Nosferatu nails, I think they went overboard with that, but he did have the whole look of Barnabas. Out of all the versions of Barnabas for these reboots, he's the one that actually kind of got the look down. And
I even like he did this great touch when he's outside where he's wearing the Tuma Ligeia sunglasses that Vincent
They put that nod in there, and he does do a pretty good impression of Frid's voice. Like he tries to capture the cadence of Jonathan Frid, but the problem is that the tone is so ridiculous. So it's too. I don't want to see Julia going down on Barnabas and stuff like what? No. How is that Dark Shadows? Like that's something else. They could have called.
But I think that. All of the things we're going to talk about today, we're all kind of off a little bit on the tone. And I think that's why I was thinking earlier today that we should be calling this episode Failure to Launch.
Failure to launch.
they were all attempts, to relaunch the franchise. And they all, for better or for worse, kind of crashed against the wall. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of it has to do with the tonality of all of it.
Yeah, it's true. But I think I'm going to go with the 2004 pilot as my least favorite, believe it or not, because I felt, although that one, the tone, at least they were going for a more horror tone in it, it was a mess. Because of and I feel like that, at least they were going for the correct tone to it, creepy. Although it lacks some of that otherworldly quality that the original show had, that gothic otherworld. But there were a lot of factors at play there. Dan Curtis wanted to do a serious gothic horror show. WB wanted something that was more like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where there was more humor in it, more young, hip people in it. Mm-hmm. The original director, Rob Bowman, left the project early on to make a movie, and he was replaced by this other director, PJ Hogan, who had no idea what Dark Shadows was, didn't care. He didn't get it. Yeah. And I'm just right now, I was going to pick the Burton film as my least favorite, honestly. But now that I think about it, after thinking about it, I might ask me tomorrow and my answer might be different,
Same here.
But today it's going to be the 2004 pilot. I thought it was miscast. I thought Blair Brown she was not very good. I thought Alec Newman was miscast. I thought it was they went too much for the young, hot actors, and it was, and no, it's like Dark Shadows has these eccentric people,
Exactly. I was going to say that, the strengths of Dark Shadows is that it had so much characters, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. and their faces had character, and their styles had character. Like you had all these people who were very different and very contrasty.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You had these young, beautiful women. You had these older women. You had, for one thing, I think one of the major things that attracts people to Dark Shadows was that it was one of the early TV shows that was very female forward.
Yes.
You had a very strong female running the family, right? In Elizabeth, and you had Carol, you had all these women. They were all very strong, and they were all very different types of women and very different women. You know, it wasn't like everybody was a model. You had beautiful women, you had older women, you had cranky women, and everybody had these amazing faces that were, some of them gaunt, some of them scary, some of them aged, you know. And the same thing with the men. You know, Jonathan Frid would not be considered, you know, traditionally handsome, certainly not in this period of time that we live in right now. Mm-hmm. You know, nowadays, if you were cast, well, look at the Burton film. When you're casting even the older male characters, you still feel obligated to cast these like handsome men when they're supposed to be somebody with a little bit more gravitas. So like someone like Roger's a perfect example. And Lou Edmonds, like, you can't, the problem with the original cast was like, you can't beat them. You can't beat Lou Edmonds as Roger Collins. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Even though I love in the 91 series.
Yeah, Roy Thinnis.
I love Roy Thinnis.
Oh, he's great. And then you had Invaders and stuff. Yeah, he's great. Yeah, but he's
Invaders
not
is one of the greatest sci-fi shows ever. Mm-hmm. You know, and Roy Thinnis is phenomenal, but you just can't beat Lou Edmonds as Roger Collins.
It's true.
It almost does a disservice to even try sometimes. And I think that's one of the other things that hurt these remakes is the fact that they're remakes, is that you're trying to outdo something that in many people's minds was perfect the way it was. Mm-hmm. You know, that's like, you know, some young painter saying, oh, I'm going to paint my version of the Mona Lisa. And you're like, well, I get that's an old painting, but it's the Mona Lisa still.
And I think that speaks to just remakes in general. Like it's often 9 out of 10 times, it's like, why did you do this? Every once in a while you get a remake that's okay, this was good, you know, but I don't know. It's rare. Like I've rarely seen remakes where I'm like, wow, this beats the original, or this stands apart from the original, where it just seems like it's trying to cash in on it or
and that's why, you know, as much as he was lambasted in the 80s when Gene Roddenberry decided to go in a completely different direction with Star Trek and bring in a new cast, and as much as that cast was lambasted and hated when it first started, they were right. That was the right choice. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
It was.
When you look at what's happening in Star Wars now, where their TV shows are so much better than anything that they've done since the original series, it's because the TV shows are in a completely different direction. And I know this is a hot debate about Dark Shadows, people, about, no, we have to redo that story versus let's do something else.
It is. Yeah, there is a big discussion about that where it's like you can't do Dark Shadows without those characters. And I would argue you shouldn't do Dark Shadows without referencing those characters. Or without especially without Barnabas. But Star Trek The Next Generation did bring, I mean, I know it's not the same thing, but they did start bringing in right off the first pilot episode.
They had Dr. McCoy,
Yeah, so they started seeding that in, and it exists in the same universe. But I can see how it's like, well, it's sad to have a story of the future where the characters you like are dead or not present. So, and it's tough to recast somebody like Jonathan Frid at the Barnabas role. Like, how are you going to do that? I think you have to get an unknown actor. Like Depp is Johnny, no matter what character Johnny Depp plays,
he's playing Johnny Depp.
He's Johnny Depp. He's so famous that it's like you're watching Johnny Depp do cosplay as Barnabas, kind of, you know. And the movie just, I don't know. Now I'm kind of leaning back to like the Burton movie is my number 4 because it's just such bad jokes and the thing with the birthing hips and just it just wasn't. I don't know. I just there was such potential with that movie, and I remember just feeling sad. I went to the midnight screening, the premiere, and
I did too.
Yeah. And it's like, what just happened here? So yeah, those two are neck and neck, you know, for
I'm sure you felt the same way I did. I felt like I was mugged.
Yes. Yeah.
Like something I loved was just stolen from me.
Totally. I just felt like this sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach because it started out pretty good. I was like, okay, yeah, this is pretty cool. And then it just jumped right off Widow's Hill with Josette. Like, it was like, oh no, what's going on here? The Mephistopheles, McDonald's jokes, the jokes just weren't funny. The one joke, I did laugh at one thing. It was like when Barnabas is with the hippies in the woods and he says, love means never having to say you're sorry. And I regret that I must now kill all of you. It was so polite, and then he kills. Then you just hear a scream. Like, it's like, okay, that was messed up. But I have a dark sense of humor anyway. But yeah. So okay. So what's your next then? Then I guess those two. We kind of did those two. The 2004 and
so that's 4 and 3. So 2 would be 91, and just like the other ones, I feel not 91. I think to me came very close to what it should be. And I think 91 also had the most Dan Curtis influence in it outside of the original show. My problem with 91 is it's so Northern California.
Yes. Yeah.
It drives me crazy. You know, it looks like Northern California. It feels like Northern California. You know, when I did my documentary about Lizzie Borden, one of the main things that I was going into was trying to figure out why people are attracted to the story of Lizzie Borden. And I found that a lot of it was just that attachment to Victorian horror, that attachment to that time period, that attachment to that look and that style. And I think Dark Shadows also has that same attachment. I think people want to play in that playground. And when you take that playground away, it takes the fun away. Because if you take the vampires and the werewolves and you stick them in Northern California, it's not as fun. It's like, what I want, if there's a new show, and I've talked to you extensively about this, is I want something that's very Yankee colonial.
Yes. Yep.
It needs to feel like New England. You know, that's why to me, the ultimate director of Dark Shadows, if I had to hire somebody today, would be Mike Flanagan, who just came off doing Midnight Mass. You know, this summer
I gotta watch that. I keep meaning to watch that. Yeah,
Midnight Mass feels like a New England film it's a New England filmmaker. You know what I mean? When I go into the Blue Whale, I want to feel like I can smell fish and chips and Narragansett beer. You know what I mean? I want that feeling. And I think that people want that feeling too, because I think that's part of the attraction is like, they've never really given us a feel of what Maine was like in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, 2000s. You know what I mean? You know, my wife and I just went there for Halloween. Actually spent Halloween on the coast in Maine, and it was like the Dark Shadows experience. Yeah. Because we were right next to a lighthouse that was on a giant stone.
Were you in Bar Harbor?
No, we were south of Bar Harbor. We were right on the border.
Okay.
And it was, like I said, it was the Dark Shadows experience without Dark Shadows. And it's like, it had the small town, the small seaside town and everything. And it's such a rich artistic base to work from. To not use it is such an injustice to Dark Shadows, because I really feel that you have 3 really immortal characters in Dark Shadows. You have Barnabas, you have Angelique, and you have the house. Okay. I think that the house should be the real centerpiece and the land should be the centerpiece, because I always felt that. And remember, you've talked about Dark Shadows, about Collinsport being a hellmouth, right? You know, what if the land, the evil comes from the land? What if it was something that goes way back to, you know, something colonials did to Native Americans when they first landed here, you know?
Or even before that, even the Native Americans feared that land. Like, we live near the Bridgewater Triangle, which is, you know, for those who don't know, it's, you know, this, I guess, like the Skinwalker Ranch, I guess, of New England. It's like any kind of paranormal thing you can imagine exists supposedly in the Bridgewater Triangle. And there's a swamp there called Hockomock Swamp, which translates to wasn't it like the devil's swamp or something like that? Like, even the Native Americans feared that area, like there was something wrong, or that, like we were saying, Stephen King, in Pet Sematary.
And the ground is sour. Area, the story of the triangle in Hockomock Swamp leads to Prince Philip's War where colonialists had betrayed Native Americans.
Yes.
And they were massacred at a rock out there, and that they cursed that land, which is a very Dark Shadows premise, isn't it?
Totally. Oh, absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely. There's so much that could be done with that. My friend Eric Marshall, who was on here, like he also suggested like the wood that was used to build Collinwood itself is cursed. Like it's enchanted. Like there's something wrong, or there's something mystical or dark about that. I totally agree. And you get that when you look at a New England forest. I mean, you get that vibe for sure.
Oh, totally. And that's why I feel, getting back to 91, and I know why they did it, because it's reasons of economy and, where they want to shoot and everything else. But when you look at this summer, we were blessed with 3 great vampire stories, one being Chapelwaite on Epix, one being American Horror Story with Blood Tide, and the other one being Midnight Mass. And they were all set in New England and had a very New England colonial look. Chapelwaite especially, when I think of what Collinsport's supposed to look like in the 1800s, that show, go look at that show, and that's what it's supposed to look like.
Yeah, you were definitely, you called me right away and you were like, you have to watch this. This is what should be what Dark Shadows looks like when they do like a flash. And it does, because they have these overhead shots, of just the thick pine trees and the somber mood of the gray skies.
The desolation,
Yeah, there's something otherworldly about that.
And these old, like chipped colonial houses that are very worn, and you know what I mean? They're by the water, and they got the old-fashioned shingles, cedar shakes that are rotting out and things like that. Those are the things that I think would add so much to Dark Shadows. See, for those of us that grew up in New England, we fill in the blanks. Because when we think about Maine and think, in our brains, we fill in the blanks because we live in those places. Yeah. But I think other people would be fascinated by it, and I think it would embellish it. So 91 also phenomenal cast. All right. Ben Cross, not perfect, but boy, I tell you, Ben Cross is close to as good as you're going to get with Jonathan Frid gone. And Gene Simmons, not so much. You know what I mean? She's good though, but she does have a lot of gravitas. But Barbara Steele, I mean,
my God, I was so excited that they cast Barbara Steele as Dr. Hoffman.
You can't do better than Barbara Steele.
It's like, look, I love Grayson Hall, but I also love Barbara Steele because she's a horror legend. That's like casting Vincent Price.
My monitor had a picture of her right now.
Right. I mean, it's like if they had cast, like they were like, Peter Cushing is playing Professor Stokes. It's just
exactly.
It's like, wow, that's awesome that that Barbara Steele is Julia. I know a lot of people didn't like her because she was very cold, but she was great. I thought she was great, and I love Grayson Hall too. Don't get me wrong, but that's such a cool
I would have almost preferred to have seen Barbara Steele as Elizabeth.
Oh, that would have been great too.
That would have been tremendous.
Yeah,
that would have been tremendous. Joanna Going was great as Victoria.
Yes,
she was excellent. She was beautiful to the point of being distracting. Like she was that like you would I would just be like staring at her and forgetting what was happening. And I thought Liza Anthony was a good idea for Angelique. Like I said, it's not a bad cast. I know they attribute a lot to all of the war started.
Yeah, the Gulf War. Yeah.
I think they make too much of that. I just don't think that a horror show on prime time at that time, knowing what was popular at prime time, like you can't go from watching Cheers to Dark Shadows. You know what I mean? The Cosby Show to Dark Shadows.
Right.
I think it was the wrong place on the dial and the wrong time. But I definitely, that's definitely my number 2. So.
Okay. Same here. I picked the 91 series as my second. I really liked the 91 series a lot. Yep. And like you said, it was the most Dan Curtis. Dan Curtis helmed that, and he brought in Sam Hall to write it from the original show, and Sam's son, Matthew Hall, Grayson Hall's husband, Sam Hall. He had Bob Cobert doing the music again. And a lot of the themes are from the original show. It's Robert Cobert. Like it was gothic, unlike like the WB pilot was horror, but I don't know if it was I will say this. I'm going to throw this out there too. One thing I did like about the 2004 pilot was that things like Victoria's cell phone doesn't work in Collinsport. Like there's no cell service. Like the cell service doesn't reach there. That is the correct choice to do. Yeah. And Mark B. Perry, when he was on here, he had a very similar idea for what he wants to do with reincarnation. There's cell service doesn't work in the Collins estate. Like it can't, for some reason, the signal doesn't reach there. That is an element, I would say, of Gothic horror, like that isolation, that feeling of isolation. They got that right. But the 91 series, Curtis, he had the fog going all the time. Yeah. He had this sort of grandiose quality to it. He brought in great actors, like you said. Having Ben Cross as Barnabas was good. I liked Gene Simmons as Elizabeth. She didn't have the same gravitas as Joan Bennett. Yeah, but
who can though? I mean,
I know.
Joan Bennett's like this. When I watch the show, right, and you look at her, first off, I'm always amazed at how beautiful she is at her age with no work. That is just her face and makeup. You know what I mean? Yeah. To maintain that beauty. And she has a poise to her and a bearing to her that is so like, I am the matriarch. I am in charge of this posse.
Yes.
And she's just, what are you going to do?
It's tough to match that. I like Gene Simmons, but not as much as Joan Bennett. I liked Ben Cross. I thought Jim Fife was too comedic as well.
Yeah. I thought so too.
A little too Pee Wee Herman-ish, I guess. John Carlin was troubled. I never understood the character. Willie was troubled.
Yeah, I never understand how people could watch John Carlin's performance and think Willie's like this goofy.
Right. They always do that. It's like Willie's not goofy. Like
not at all. Not at all. He had that sort of dangerous. Like you would believe like he was a serial killer in the 60s. He had that kind of a feel to him. One of those. I'm never a big fan of like the Hepcat talk. You know what I mean? Especially in early Dark Shadows.
Oh, right. Yes.
Hey, like man, Buzz. How you moving, baby?
Yeah. John Carlin he could be, some of Willie's reactions of terror could be humorous sometimes, like when he's dealing with Adam and stuff like that. But there was something crazy about Willie. Like there was something off about Willie. And you feel for Willie once he's humbled by the vampire and forced to do these horrible things. Yeah. It's like, he was a piece of garbage, but now he's dealing with something horrendously dark, but Jim Fife, I thought was too goofy. I know a lot of people liked him, but I don't know. I was not a huge fan of his Willie. I liked the mood of that show. The first couple hours of the show were a remake of House of Dark Shadows, basically. Right. And then it goes into, they bring in Sarah. It's the only one that they got Sarah in there, which kind of brings in the conscience for Barnabas. They did the 1700s flashback, which was good, 1790 in their 91 show, I believe. So you get to see Angelique, which was cool. You get to see the Collins family of the past, but it ended so prematurely. And that was such a shame because I was into it. Like it was a big deal that Dark Shadows was coming back. Like it had been gone for 20 years. Mm-hmm. And here it is, 91, the Dark Shadows is coming back. There was a huge, but it was on the cover of, I remember all those TV listings that would come with the newspaper and with Dark Shadows on the cover of a lot of those. And it was a big deal, and unfortunately it ended prematurely. They blamed the Gulf War. I think there was a combination of things. I do think it was kind of a bad time slot for it too. Maybe it was just people weren't ready for a horror show. Like you said, coming off Cheers. I don't remember what led into Dark Shadows before, what the show that went into it. And then it was gone. And there were all these I remember even in New Bedford here, there was like a protest in front of City Hall. And I went to that and I'm like, why did they do it in front of, what does that have to do with anything? Like, what is New Bedford City Hall? How are they going to stop NBC from taking Dark Shadows off the air? I think that was organized by WBSM, actually. Yeah. Or Fun 107, one of those. Which, by the way, somebody from Fun 107 wrote an article just yesterday. My cousin tagged me in it about Dark Shadows. People from New Bedford loved running home to watch Dark Shadows. Yeah. But one thing that you mentioned, there was very much a Hollywood look to it. And I know Dan Curtis wanted it to be glossy, but I wish they had come out here to shoot it, or at least someplace that looked New England.
But that's the thing is I don't think those of us who love the show want glossy. Like people always like, oh, the original show looks cheap. And it's like, yeah, but there's a character to it. But I'm not saying make it look cheap. What I'm saying is like, we want like, we need a little verisimilitude. Like we need to feel like this is a real place with real people doing real stuff. And that's what, if you can do that, it makes everything else work. Everything, it's nonsense. But if you can get me to believe that this is a real family dealing with real stuff, then I can accept the vampires, then I can accept the ghosts, then I can accept everything else. You know what I mean?
I remember noticing Ben Cross had a tan in one of them. Well, he's a vampire. Why does he have a tan? That doesn't make any sense. It's like this Hollywood tan for Ben
ruggedly
Cross.
handsome.
Yes, and but it's too bad. I would have liked to have seen. The other thing too is Dan Curtis was doing kind of like picking all the like memorable moments from the original
greatest
show
hits
and redoing those moments in the show, and there wasn't enough new stuff like to kind of go, oh, this came out of left field kind of thing. Like, but I wish they had kept going because they were going to do Quentin. They were going to have Adrian Paul come back as Quentin because he played Jeremiah in the flashback. They were going to have him come back and be Quentin, and they were going to bring Angelique into the present. Like they were setting up stuff for the next season. And it's too bad it didn't continue on from there. Yeah.
Well, I want to make sure we get the last one in because I'm looking at it. We're running out of time. Yeah. But yes, let's talk about House of Dark Shadows.
Go for it.
What I love about House of Dark Shadows is it was Dark Shadows turned up to 11, where you got the gore and you got the violence and you got everything else. Like Barnabas's death at the end is like nuts.
Oh my God.
It's like insane. Bananas Italian horror death.
It really is. Yes.
But I'm a sucker for that time period, 1970s cinema. I'm a sucker for how that film and cinematography looks. Obviously, I'm a sucker for that whole cast. Once again, I don't like that they streamline the story so much, and I'm trying to remember if Victoria was even in it because...
No, it was Maggie.
Yeah, it went straight to Maggie. It totally bypassed anything to do with Victoria. Once again, it's like they streamline everything and they economize everything when they do this stuff. And it's like, let's just leave. I want to tell the people out there who might be making a future Dark Shadows, people today are going to be happy and excited to find lore to work with. Yeah. People love an excuse to go look up canon and look up backstories, and they're going to do YouTube videos about backstories. They're going to cover that for you. All right. If you make a really good Dark Shadows show set in the present, 1 million content creators will be happy to do a Best of Barnabas Collins video on YouTube that's going to get everybody up to speed. Yeah. Right. All you have to do is allude to these people, and people who love the show will fill in the blanks. Yep. Okay. This isn't like back in the day when we 20 years ago, it was difficult to go back and get all the Dark Shadows tapes, as you know, and rewatch everything. But now they can just watch it on Tubi if they want to watch the whole thing, or go on YouTube and somebody's going to make a video about the history of Angelique, the history of Barnabas, the history of Willie. And all of that's going to be streamlined, which gives producers nowadays an excuse to focus on the story they want to tell.
Yes.
I mean, look, like last week, Book of Boba Fett.
I was about to say, bring that up. We're all the same wave. Like spoilers, by the way, if you have not seen the newest episode of Book of Boba Fett, if you're into that.
But last week they brought in Cad Bane from the animated series, and there was 8,000 History of Cad Bane videos put out.
Which I watched several of them.
Exactly. So it's like, don't worry about it. Don't waste you are wasting your time. People want to dig for treasure. Let them dig. Right. The audience, Andrew Stanton, the great filmmaker, said the audience wants to work for its meal. So let them work for their meal. Like I said, the problem, one of the problems with 91 is that they had to recap everything. Yeah. So don't waste the 12 episodes you get recapping everything, because you might not make it to season 2. All right. Make a great season 1 and let the people go look for everything. They'll enjoy looking for everything. Because, and you and I know, and Dark Shadows fans know that they're going to find some gold. Yeah.
If you throw in references to it, like hints, like about it, like something that happened or something, people will, like you said, they'll make those videos, like, and if it's popular, people are going to want to find out more about those characters and about concepts that come back into, like, they'll bring back the Leviathans. Well, what's the Leviathan? Who are the Leviathans? That kind of thing. Sure.
And I want to bring back Leviathans. I told you the other day, I said, I think the Leviathans are the way to tie in everything.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you could prove that there was some cult that existed in Collinsport, that was into the bad stuff long before the Collinses even arrived, and tie it all in, I think that works out great.
Sure.
And you have the seeds of that already in the original series.
Mm-hmm.
So work with that. There's so many things. It's just.
Yeah, definitely.
It's fingers crossed.
yeah. It's funny you mentioned that. I was literally going to say the same thing. Like, after I watched the Book of Boba Fett, like, I knew who Cad Bane was, but I hadn't watched like Clone Wars or Rebels or any of those cartoons, which I have to go back and watch those. But I was like, I know that character. I've seen that character, pictures of him and stuff. So I went back and watched. And they did the same with like Ahsoka and some of those other characters that they bring in to the show, or Chrysanthemum. The Black Chrysanthemum, the Wookiee, the bad guy Wookiee. I was like, who's that? And like you said, all those videos about that. And of course, this is Star Wars, so they're going to get 50,000 views in the first day, but Dark Shadows might not get as many views in the first. But I think you're going to see stuff like that pop up for new versions and new iterations of Dark Shadows. And I honestly think they're going to keep revisiting Dark Shadows because
it's a good story.
It's a good story. And I want to get to this, but first I'll give you my number one also is House of Dark Shadows, which it was kind of like one of those things like the TV show where my Uncle Val would go like, oh, they made the two movies, House and Night of Dark Shadows. And he's like, House of Dark Shadows, Barnabas was really mean in that. Wait till you see that. And he finally got a copy of it and we watched it. He was right. It's not only a great Dark Shadows movie, but it's very dark. It's darker shadows. Dark shadows. Yes. Yeah. And everybody, like most of the characters die, but it's also an excellent vampire movie. Like, I think I would say if the, top 10 vampire movies, it's going to be in that list. Mm-hmm. I think House of Dark Shadows, you can give that movie to somebody, which I have several times. You can give that movie to somebody without having watched the TV show, and they're going to watch a really good vampire movie,
Right. Absolutely.
And it has a post-credit scene and everything, like with the bat, spoilers, the bat, so because they were hoping they were going to do a sequel, they wanted Jonathan Frid to come back and where he didn't want to do the sequel. So you got Night of Dark Shadows instead, which had Quentin and Angelique and Kate Jackson and Tracy, but there was no Barnabas in that. But there were I think that bat at the end like indicates a Barnabas.
Right.
Maybe the stake didn't go through the heart. Maybe it just grazed his heart. Who knows?
I don't know, man.
That
was one of the most legit impalings of all vampires.
It was pretty intense. But it was the cast from the original show. It was Dan Curtis. It was like the show coming off its height, of popularity. But that was what I was going to seg into, is that I think sometimes it's difficult to convey to younger people who were not there at the time, how immensely popular Dark Shadows was when it was on. It was a phenomenon, it was a pop culture phenomenon, and kids would run home from school to watch Dark Shadows, and there was all kinds of merchandise for it. It was Jonathan Frid was like the Beatles. He'd go on these tours, and you'd see pictures of it. He was surrounded by mobs of people, and I think there's money to be made there potentially. The last couple of attempts have not been successful. We know that, but I think there's always, we're fans, so we're looking at it as fans, but I think the bean counters, the advertisers, and, they're looking for the bottom line. And Dark Shadows was a massive success at one point in the United States. People always hope that lightning's going to strike twice. And that's why they keep going back to the well, because this worked at one point. Yeah. Something at one point caused this to work. I don't think they can capture lightning in a bottle again and do the same thing again. That's why I like that Mark B. Perry with the Dark Shadows Reincarnation is doing a sequel show, because like Star Trek, you can have new stories that exist in that world that fill in the book, continue the story and reference things from the past. So you can have a lot of really, really good stuff come from that potentially.
And Mark Perry gives me a lot of hope. He gives me a lot of hope. And like I said earlier, even if the people are going to bristle at the beginning, we all want, like I keep saying, we want to play in that playground.
Yeah.
And even the most hardcore, don't make a next generation people. If Mark makes a great playground for them to play in, they're going to show up eventually.
Yeah.
Because we don't get a nice playground that's got vampires and, Frankenstein and wolves and all that. We don't get that very often.
Yeah, that's true.
And if we get a nice one, we're going to show up, know. Even the naysayers, they're going to want to be there because they wanted to be there before.
They're all going to watch it. And even though I was complaining about the 2004 pilot, I would have watched that show. If that had gone to series, I would have watched it.
When I heard about the pilot, right, for years, I was trying to track it down because I was desperate to watch it. And even though I knew it was a failed pilot, I was beside myself, like online, like, can I download it? Does somebody have it? And I would go to horror conventions. Horror conventions always had like bootlegs of pilots.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And
I'd always be like looking for it there. And like, I didn't give a shit that somebody said, oh, it's not that great. I'm like, I don't care.
Yeah.
I need it. I need to see it.
Yeah. Yep. And then it took a while for that to emerge. They showed it at one of the Dark Shadows conventions I went to. I think it was the year before we went, because we went to one of the Dark Shadows festivals together, actually.
Jonathan Frid's last one in New York, right?
Yeah, that was cool. Yeah. And I'd gone with Magoo maybe the year before or 2 years before, but they did show it at the one I went to with Magoo. Yeah. And that version, the one that's on YouTube, is altered from the one I saw because the ending of the original one, they must have, the CGI wasn't completed for that at the ending of that pilot. Yeah. And it was way more ridiculous and over the top in the version I saw at the festival. Yes, when Angelique crashes through the windshield, she's like, ah! And then Vicky screams, and then Angelique screams, and then Vicky screams. It goes back and forth to the point of absurdity, like the Burton film. It would have been something you'd see in the Burton film. Whereas the one on YouTube is more toned down. So whoever was involved with putting that up must have fixed that ending before uploading it, I'm guessing. Okay, so I want to do one more thing before we kind of end things here. So we ranked these, and then we talked, I mentioned, all the merchandise that came out of Dark Shadows when it was so popular and you had all this stuff. I know you interviewed at Rhode Island Comic Con, Dr. Migo, was it Paul Clark? Dr. Migo. And Migo is back in a big way, and they're doing all they're very successful with their horror figures. They got the Universal license. Yep. They did the Unimaginable and got the Hammer license, which nobody ever thought that would happen. Like they're doing Hammer figures. They're doing all kinds of characters from modern horror, classic horror. And which I love that you did this, you on video too. You asked him, you said, I'd love to see a whole line of Dark Shadows figures. And I think he had some connection with the Spectre toys when they did those figures as well. They used the Migo tooling to do that. I think Rick Fairs, who did the Spectre toys, was involved with MC and Diamond Select, all that stuff. I think he was involved with. And Dr. Migo said, he said Barnabas sold really well, but the other two, he's like, Dark Shadows, I know it well. Yes. Angelina, he called Angelique Angelina. I was like
Angelina's my wife.
Yeah.
My wife's Angelina.
And the werewolf, but I said, okay, well, so I mean, I'm hopeful that Migo will do Dark Shadows figures. They should at least do a Barnabas, but I'd love to see it if they did, at least the big three. If they did Barnabas, Quentin, and Angelique, that would be.
I mean, really how could if you do Barnabas, how can you not have Angelique?
Yeah, you got to, and they have. I assume they still have the tooling for that. I'd like to see a new sculpt though, like something new. The Spectre Toys ones, I was not too happy with the brown. I don't know why they kept putting Barnabas in these brown cloaks. I'm like, put him in black. Like,
do you guys not watch the show? Or?
Yeah, like what's it? Somebody's like off with the colors here. Was the brown cloth cheaper? Like, why is Barnabas all in brown? But that the coat should be black. So what are your thoughts on like Dark Shadows merchandise, Migo figures, anything like that? What would you like to see?
Well, I mean, you and I are big toy collectors. You and I are massive action figure collectors. We're both, you and I, if people could see a cutaway of you and I right now, and both of us are sitting in rooms coated in action figures and models, right?
Yes.
So obviously we want that, if anything, for the sake of economy, because any Dark Shadows figure, if you want to get those figures, are a fortune. Right now,
insane. It's really expensive.
All my Hammer figures I paid no more than $15 for.
Yeah.
So I'd like to. Dark Shadows is tough because I think I told you about this, that, Dark Shadows is such a mature audience that, what is germane to them in 2022? Like I said earlier, they're doing a Kolchak novel now. They're kickstarting a Kolchak novel. And I would like to see that for Dark Shadows. I'd like to see a compilation of Dark Shadows stories written by current horror authors,
Oh, that'd be cool. Yeah.
Yeah, not just fanfic, but like get some big horror authors or some semi-big horror authors who grew up with it to write a little story.
Stephen King is a big Dark Shadows fan. He talks about it in Danse Macabre. He has a whole section devoted to it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, in Salem's Lot is so much, and the story of Jerusalem's Lot. Like if you're a Dark Shadows fan, you have to watch Chapelwaite on Epics, because that is like Dark Shadows adjacent. I could almost say, right?
It has that mood to it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the same time, same place, but it's the way New England should look. Right. Some of it's a little goofy with the vampires, but not so much. And I'd like to see that. I'd like to see some really great stories first so that we could build up the canon. And they did that a lot with Big Finish and with some of the books. But I'd like to see something more organized and more like, consistent. I think there's definitely a fan base there to work with, because at the end of the day, Dark Shadows is the grandfather/grandmother of romantic vampiric horror. You know what I mean?
Totally. Yep.
And people love that. People love vampires, love the loss of love. You know what I mean? Dark Shadows is really a story about longing and using supernatural means to try to deal with your longing. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
your loss.
Yeah.
And I think that always connects with people. And if you give them that feeling of, I want my love back, and I'm willing to turn people into monsters to do it. That's why Shakespeare works, hundreds of years later, because that concept is as old as time. There's nothing more classic than loving someone and wishing you could move God and the earth and everything else to get them back.
Sure.
Or to make them love you. And I think that's one of the, Dark Shadows uses monsters, but it really is about, how we will turn into a monster if we don't get those things back,
Right. Yeah, it tells these sort of archetypal stories through supernatural characters. Yeah.
Right. And at the end of the day, it's all about, I want my love back.
Sure. It's funny how a lot of, I think there isn't enough awareness of the fact that you wouldn't have things like supernatural characters as the protagonists trying to, with a romantic twist to it, but that feeling of like things like Angel or Anne Rice, who was a big Dark Shadows fan with Louis in Interview with the Vampire, that informed Dark Shadows informed Interview with a Vampire clearly. Big time. Oh, for sure. The late Anne Rice, she was a Dark Shadows fan. And they even did a storyline like that in Dark Shadows where Willie, in parallel time, Willie is William H. Loomis, or an author who traps Barnabas in his coffin and tries to write a book, literally is interviewing Barnabas to write a book about it. Like, wow, this is, but that kind of thing was a massive influence on genre storytelling.
Absolutely. It opens so much up.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because the universal monsters are mythological and they're almost godlike and infallible, where Dark Shadows, we had to deal with Barnabas wondering what he's having for dinner tonight. Or, wondering if he's going to be late for the date that he has with Victoria, or just being frustrated with day-to-day garbage. And it put that seed into people's mind where they were like, you look at, you and I both love What We Do in the Shadows.
Oh, I love that. Yes. So
and, good. What we do in Shadows is that concept turned up to 11, where it's like, what does a vampire do on Tuesday afternoon?
Yeah. Yeah.
Where they can't just be droll and, killing people. You know what I mean? How do they deal with just going in their groceries or something like that?
Did you watch the newest season of that?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
What a weird ending that was for that season.
It was. Once again, it's just like, how do we deal with? I love that they had that big fight over who gets to sit in the chair in the Vampire Council.
Yes. That's a show where they should reference Barnabas. Like, I wish they would throw a reference in to Barnabas. Like,
there was a great episode. I remember when they were put on trial and they had all the other vampires and they had Blade.
Wesley Snipes through Skypes in through.
And they had what's her face?
Paul Rubens was there.
Paul Rubens was there from the original Buffy.
Yeah.
They had the girl from True Blood.
Yeah. Yes.
Like, how did they not cut to somebody playing Barnabas? You know?
Exactly. Yeah. Or I wish they would throw. That's what I mean. I'd love to see more like just pop culture awareness of Dark Shadows. Like, it just feels like it was such a huge thing, and then it's like, I think now there's more awareness of it. But I remember when I was in high school and stuff, nobody else seemed to know what it was. You know,
I think like I was saying earlier, you and I, we grew up in a period where it was right after the initial series run. But I think you probably had the same experience I did, where you would go to yard sales and flea markets.
Oh, yeah.
And that was the key time where you'd see, like, what is this book? Yeah. And you'd pick up a Marilyn Ross book, and there's a vampire on the cover, and you're like, I don't know why. I want this because there's a vampire on the cover of Dark Shadows, right?
Yeah.
Or we'd see those postcards. Yeah. And we'd be like, and I'm sitting 6 inches away from my Barnabas Collins models.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'd see a busted up Barnabas Collins model, and I'd be like, what's that about? You know?
Yeah.
So like I always said, it was in our ether, like it was around us, and because we are who we are, we gravitated towards it because that's the stuff we like. We're like, this guy looks spooky. What's this about?
Rick, closing thoughts. What are your hopes for the future of potential Dark Shadows?
Well, I think now is actually the perfect time to bring back Dark Shadows because we have the perfect modality for Dark Shadows. Online streaming is the perfect modality for Dark Shadows because you don't have to worry about an MPA rating. You don't have to worry about what the overnight ratings are. You have plenty of time to tell the story that you want to tell. Okay. And you could give it time to breathe and let it find its audience. Because that's the reason why the things that we talked about today that I think they failed to launch was none of them were given time to breathe and find their audience. And Dark Shadows needs that because it's looking for very specific people. Like I said, they're looking for people like us who want to play in that playground. And I think that the Netflix, Amazon Prime, modality now affords that. And I think Chapelwaite is a perfect example of that, and Midnight Mass. Those are two projects that would have never gotten off the ground before. And they worked out beautifully in the niche that they're in. And even if Dark Shadows just goes on something like Epix, which is a lower tier streaming service, right? They did a beautiful show on that service. You know what I mean? Chapelwaite looks gorgeous. And I'd be happy to watch that show and I would give them my money. And then let people look for the lore. Let people fill in the blanks. Let people make those YouTube videos. I've always told you that my dream for the remake would be have it like Grey Gardens. When I think of Dark Shadows, I think of Grey Gardens, where the show is about, we find Carolyn living with Maggie in Collinwood and the place is a wreck. Just a wreck. But there's this woman who does this genetic online thing and finds out she's actually related to the Collinses. And she's like this burnt out actress, right?
Yeah.
So she goes to Collinwood just like Jackie Onassis went to Grey Gardens.
Yeah.
And she's like, we need to fix this place up, And they're like, no, this place needs to die.
Yeah.
And she's like, I'm not having it, And her persistence just reignites all of the bad.
Perfect. I love it.
Reignites all of the bad, Yeah. And I have this dream that I have this vision in my head of a main fishing boat, like a lobster boat, and it's pulling traps and it pulls up Barnabas's casket.
Oh, cool.
And they crack it open and just bats fly out. But the thing is that the new series should be partly about, the B story should be about Barnabas got wrapped in chains and thrown in the ocean sometimes in the late 70s, early 80s, and we don't know why.
Yeah.
And he doesn't know why.
Oh, mystery.
And he wants to find out who the hell did that to him.
Yeah.
Why was he trapped in the ocean for the last 50 years?
Yeah.
In the main frozen ocean. So that should be like one of the background things. Like we're trying to figure that out. And the other one should be about, what was going on at the house, why does Carolyn want all of this to die? And I like that because we could bring back the original actors and actresses because they can tease all the new people because they have all this depth. And the people like us who love it, in our heads, we're like, oh, we know what happened. We know what that's all about.
Right.
You know what I mean? And they can allude to things,
Yep. Yeah.
So that's kind of my dream and my hope. But
I
hey,
love
like
that.
I say, if ifs and buts were candy and nuts, it'd be Christmas all year round.
I love those ideas. I mean, that's a great setup, and it's a good way to kind of take Barnabas off the chessboard for several decades and bring him back. And also adding a mystery to it, like why did this happen?
Right?
How did Collinwood get to be this way? There's a lot you can play with that. There are, I asked this to a lot of my guests, especially horror fans. Dark Shadows was known for incorporating a lot of classic horror tales or terror tales into the mix of the stories.
Yep.
Is there any classic horror story or monster or kind of horror archetype that you would have liked to have seen used in Dark Shadows, or that could still work if they do a new Dark Shadows?
Well, being a Lovecraft fan and a New England guy, obviously Shadow over Innsmouth is a big one.
Oh, the deep ones. Yeah.
Yeah, the deep ones. Yeah, and that would tie into my whole thing with Barnabas being chucked into the Atlantic.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, is there an island off the coast of Collinsport where these strange people have been living? These strange fish people have been living all this time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or, are the Collins family being abducted by this weird cult of people living out there?
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of like that. That's where I'd kind of like to go.
Mm-hmm.
Shadow of Innsmouth, Herbert West Reanimator, but that's kind of a, Adam story as it is.
Mm-hmm.
Adam is almost, to me, more Reanimator than he is Frankenstein.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at how those stories are set up. But yeah, there's so many things that they could go into. Yeah. I mean, as far as you've talked about The Mummy, I think that's a perfect one because you tie in Boston, you tie in museums.
Yeah.
Someone's donating a sarcophagus to the museum in Maine, you know what I mean? And it kicks off a big thing. Or have somebody in the Collins family, because there's big tracts of history that we're missing here in Collinwood. I remember the 1920s and 30s. That was the age of rich people going to Egypt and doing and climbing Mount Everest and doing all this other stuff. Another thing that Dark Shadows has never done. It's never done winter.
No, it's true. Yeah, you never see snow in Collinsport, which in Maine,
it'd be 9 months a year.
Yes,
9 months a year.
Yeah,
and you have the Native American monster there. Oh my!
The Wendigo.
The Wendigo.
Yeah, that.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Sure.
Wendigo has a time and a place for that. We haven't touched any Native American stuff in Dark Shadows. And as you and I both said, Native American folklore is a big part of New England.
Yes.
We're not just witches and other things, and vampires. There's a lot of a Native American folklore, and Dark Shadows never touched that. Yeah. We don't know what the Collins family did during the period of spiritualism. What happened then? Who in the family did something then? We don't know what they did during the Atomic Age. What were they like during World War II and right after World War II?
Sure. Yeah, that'd be fascinating. And young Elizabeth and Roger, that would be fun to see for sure.
Was Elizabeth and Roger's parents, these scientists that created some sort of mutation during the Atomic Age? We don't know. So that there's so much fun to be had. There's no end. And that's the beauty of Dark Shadows and why we love it, is that it's so much to work with.
You can just pull in all this great stuff and just reimagine it for that universe. That's part of the fun of Dark Shadows. Shadow over Innsmouth would be interesting. I remember I got shouted down one time. I was like on some message board. I might have been the Classic Horror Film Board, where I put out the theory. I was like, what if the creature from the Black Lagoon is a deep one? And some people are like, oh, that would be interesting. Some people are like, no, absolutely not. Yeah, I think he's probably more of like a cryptid that's more than anything else, because if you look at the other Universal monsters, they're all kind of either the supernatural or disfigured or whatever, but the creature is like, what is the creature? He's kind of a cryptid. That's why I don't think
John, I don't know if I tell you this story, when I went to see John Landis and his son Max, right? Max Landis told a story about when he asked his dad, because his dad had done Innocent Blood, the vampire movie. He said, and of course he did American Werewolf in London, which is, one of the biggest werewolf movies ever.
Sure.
He said, Dad, how do you kill a vampire? And John Landis said, you know how you kill him, son? Any way you want, because vampires aren't real. Right? So do you know about the creature of Black Lagoon? Is he from Innsmouth? He can be. You know why? Because the creature of Black Lagoon is not real.
Exactly. And that's he is. I thought he was real.
And that's the beauty of what we could do with Dark Shadows, is that we have that leverage because none of this stuff is real.
Yeah. I guess that explains why in American Werewolf in London, he did all the werewolf lore except for the silver bullet at the end. I'm like, because they use don't they use regular bullets on the werewolf? Right? I was like, he did everything else. He did the full moon. He did the pentagram. He did all of that. But then he he did regular bullets.
Right.
That must have been his way of saying that, I guess. But awesome, Rick. Well,
thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh my God, it was really fun geeking out with you and talking about Dark Shadows and our shared love of spooky stuff. Are you working on anything right now, film wise? Or
I just put in for a sabbatical I want to do a documentary about Edgar Allan Poe in Providence.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Edgar Allan Poe had a very torrid love affair in Providence and got engaged and broken up in Providence. And I want to do something about that.
Yeah.
Because Poe and Lovecraft literally were walking the same streets, 50 years apart. So there's something about Benefit Street, and you've been there, about that Benefit Street, College Hill area that is literally the heart of American horror.
See, it was Sarah Whitman. Sarah Whitman, the poet. Yeah. And Poe was born in Boston, which a lot of people don't know. I tell my students that, and they all think he's from Baltimore.
Right.
And it's like, no, Poe was born in Boston. Of course, there was a very adversarial kind of relationship between Poe and Boston, but I'm glad Boston finally acknowledged the fact that Poe was born there by putting that statue of him on the pavement. And then, of course, he kept coming back here. He came to Providence and stuff, like you said, but that's awesome. I look forward to seeing that documentary.
I mean, Rhode Island has so much background in Dark Shadows that Dark Shadows, even like a lot of hardcore Dark Shadows fans, I don't think realize how important Rhode Island is to Dark Shadows. It's like Collinwood is in Rhode Island.
It is Newport. It's in Seaview Terrace is in Newport, Rhode Island. And I always get a kick out of it. They reference in the original show, they reference New Bedford a couple of times. They reference Fall River. And this is Massachusetts, but we're in southeastern Massachusetts, which is pretty close to Rhode Island.
Yep.
They every time they toss one of those names out, I'm like, oh my God, that's really
I proposed to my first wife on the rocks in the opening credits.
No way, really?
I took her out to the rocks over there in Newport. So it's it's always a little funny when I see the opening credits. Yeah. Well, that didn't work out for me, just like it didn't work out for me. That's why I wish more Dark Shadows fans came down and took a look at that part of Newport, because it does have that romance and that Yankee feeling that Dark Shadows should have. That look is there. That grass that's been blown for hundreds of years across the water and stuff like that, and all those Newport houses on steep hills and things like that. Mm-hmm. It would give you more of a feel. Like I said, I love Dark Shadows also because of the feel that it gives me, and I think that's what it needs to have to make it work again. Yeah. It has to have that tone that drags people in.
I agree. Absolutely. Definitely has. And that tone should not be
Barnabas brushing his fangs in the mirror with no reflection.
Northern California, Barnabas with a tan.
No. Anyway, Rick, well, thank you so much for sitting down with me and talking about Dark Shadows. Mm-hmm. Folks, thank you for listening. Please do subscribe to the podcast. Please do like the podcast if you listen to it on YouTube, and share it with your friends. Get the word out. If you have friends who like Dark Shadows or like classic horror or spooky stuff in general, hip them to the podcast. They might just enjoy it. This is about keeping Dark Shadows alive or undead, so to speak, keeping it going. And thank you very much for listening.
And for as long as they lived, the Dark Shadows never truly dissipated, for there will always be terror at Collinwood. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.